Some actors quietly disappeared. Others were suddenly replaced. A few exits are so bizarre, fans are still talking decades later. Why did this happen? Were the reasons personal, professional, or something stranger? From shocking on-screen twists to decisions made in the writer's room, the truth behind these departures isn't what you might expect. Let's take a closer look at the real reasons these actors left Seinfeld. John Randolph, Frank Costanza. If you ask longtime Seinfeld fans which character made them laugh the hardest, odds are Frank Costanza lands near the top of the list. Loud, volcanic, and endlessly quotable, Frank gave us Serenity Now, Festivus, and more explosive outbursts than George could handle in a lifetime. But here's a detail many casual viewers don't know. The Frank we all remember wasn't the original Frank. When George's father first appeared in Season 4 as a handicap spot, he wasn't played by Jerry Stiller. Instead, the role belonged to John Randolph, a veteran actor whose career stretched back to Broadway in the 1930s and included decades of film and television. Randolph's Frank was calm, mild-mannered, and delivered with a warmth that felt familiar to sitcom audiences. He was believable as George's father, but in the world of Seinfeld, believable wasn't enough. Randolph's performance leaned into tradition. He played the kind of kindly dad you might see on Family Ties or The Brady Bunch, steady and reassuring. But Seinfeld thrived on breaking sitcom rules, turning small annoyances into epic comedy. For George, a character defined by anxiety, screaming, and constant self-sabotage, a mild, measured father didn't reflect the chaos he clearly inherited. Behind the scenes, producers recognized the problem almost immediately. Jason Alexander's George had become a ball of neuroses and paranoia, and the role of his father needed to match that manic intensity. A soft counterpoint might have worked on another show, but here it clashed with the rhythm. Randolph wasn't giving a poor performance. He simply wasn't in tune with the escalating absurdity that Seinfeld demanded. So, the creative team made a bold move. They recast the role. Enter Jerry Stiller, whose explosive delivery instantly redefined Frank. Stiller's Frank wasn't just George's father. He was George magnified, a walking powder keg who shouted his way into TV history. For Randolph, it meant his association with Seinfeld came to an end a little faster than it had begun. Unlike all those other actors who can boast years of storylines, this wasn't a violent or scandalous exit. Rather, it was a case of artistic redirection, in one of the rare moves in television. The producers even res-hot his original scenes with Stiller, so syndication could show him consistently as Frank. Such an unusual move effectively erased Randolph's version from reruns, leaving only a few original broadcasts and trivia notes as proof that another Frank ever existed. The choice is indicative of just how iconic Frank would eventually become. It explains, too, why so many fans never knew Randolph was once Frank. His few lines were sacrificed for a version that would better fuel the show's rhythm, though his short role remains a tantalizing what-if in sitcom history. Randolph's Frank is a very different Costanza household, an environment seemingly less confused or chaotic, more conventional, and even, on a certain level, ready to empathize. George would look less like the product of a dysfunctional home and more like a projection of an odd case. By Stiller being put in, it multiplied the maladjusted idea that George has always been just that, a clear reflection of his environment, raised in a family where the shouting came for granted. Randolph, despite leaving the show, did not have a lagging career afterwards. He continued to work in TV and theater for quite some time. He had done some serious justice for himself as a versatile actor for his generation. By no means was this exit a career fall. It was simply meant to be. Now, it is almost impossible to think of Seinfeld without recalling Stiller as Frank, the man who could probably have introduced Festivus and shouting battles to opera level with Estelle. But before Stiller gave this role immortality, it must be remembered that John Randolph did stand there first. Therefore, his exit was not an exit of ineptitude, but of serious soul-searching on what the sitcom needed to survive, in which case dropping a good performance was a right move to make way for a perfect one. Keep your jaw from dropping, because the story that comes next is on a whole new level. Phil Brunn's Morty Seinfeld. When most people think of Jerry's parents on Seinfeld, they imagine the couple in their Florida condo, caught up in petty battles over Cadillacs, wallets, and community politics. Morty, stubborn and perpetually indignant, and Helen, doting yet unyielding, became a perfect reflection of retirement absurdities. But what many fans forget or never knew is that the Morty Seinfeld who became iconic wasn't the one audiences first met. In the Seinfeld pilot, Morty Seinfeld was originally played by Phil Bruns, a familiar character actor whose career stretched across decades of television. Bruns' Morty was warm, genial, and easygoing. He offered Jerry quiet support, smiled often, and carried himself with the demeanor of a classic sitcom father. It was a pleasant performance, the kind that wouldn't feel out of place in more traditional comedies of the time. The problem wasn't Bruns' ability. It was tone. Seinfeld thrived on conflict, awkwardness, and the comedy of frustration. A calm, genial father didn't provide the friction the show needed. In a world where George's parents were practically operatic in their screaming matches, Jerry's father couldn't afford to fade into the background. He needed edge, stubbornness, and the kind of petty defiance that could turn small inconveniences into epic feuds. Behind the scenes, the creative team recognized this mismatch. Bruns gave Morty sincerity, but he lacked the spark of combative absurdity that would make the character memorable. By the time season 2 arrived, they made a decisive change. Morty Seinfeld was recast with Barney Martin. The difference was immediate. Martin brought Morty to life as a cantankerous, proud, and hilariously petty man. Suddenly, Jerry's father wasn't just a supportive presence. He was a force of nature. He argued about pens, bickered over wallets, and fought condo board members with the conviction of a political revolutionary. His gravelly voice and stubborn streak gave Morty a distinctive personality that not only stood out, but became a cornerstone of many subplots. The actual recast developed all the more relationship complications between Morty and Helen, as played by Liz Sheridan. While Helen remained a protective, sweet counterbalance, Martin's Morty was all for righteous indignation and stubborn pride. What pushed and pulled between her calm loyalty and his heated testiness mirrored genuine family relationships, while blowing those same qualities out to comedic extremes. It's the kind of interplay a softer Morty, under Bruns' portrayal, would never have known. One of Martin Morty's defining arcs happened in the Cadillac storyline, when Jerry bought his parents a luxury car. What started as an innocent gesture turned into a nightmare, with Morty being accused of corruption by his neighbors. It was those kind of episodes that worked, Martin giving Morty a self-righteous point of view that made him more than just Jerry's dad. He became the keystone around which entire plots could bear. Instead, Bruns' Morty is unlikely to produce such fun story arcs. His luster was pleasant, but not appreciably distinct enough to get inspired comedy relief from the little vexations in life. And in Seinfeld, comedy lay invariably in detail, the minutiae of wallets and parking places and condo politics, while Martin's Morty made those details gigantic problems. Phil Bruns' exit was not a scandal or a dramatic fallout. It was simply a recalibration. The Morty he played was not wrong. Rather, it was just not right for a show that needed heightened absurdity. Bruns continued working steadily in television and film, demonstrating the professionalism and versatility that have made him a dependable actor for decades. His brief stint in Seinfeld will not be the most memorable point in his career, but it is, nonetheless, the footnote that shows how casting decisions can be quite delicate in the reshaping of a series. It is Martin's performance that brings Morty Seinfeld to life in the minds of fans today, his gravelly declarations, his stubborn battles, and his unshakable pride in the raincoat business. However, it is worth remembering that before the Morty figure became iconic, he was first introduced by Phil Bruns. Heidi Swedberg, Susan Ross. If you ask Seinfeld fans to name the show's darkest and most shocking twist, most will point to the sudden death of George Costanza's fiancée, Susan Ross. On a series that prided itself on no hugging, no learning, slaying off a recurring character with a gag about envelope glue was peak Seinfeld. But behind the outrageous punchline was a quieter story, one about chemistry, not scandal. Introduced in season 4, Susan was smart, polished, and slightly stern, exactly the type of person viewers never expected George to attract. As an NBC executive, she gave Jerry and George the green light for their pilot, tied her fate to theirs within the show's meta-arc. Over time, her relationship with George developed awkwardly. They dated, broke up, reunited, and by season 7, found themselves engaged. For a character like George, cheap, neurotic, and terrified of commitment, this was huge. Fans assumed the engagement would fuel fresh comedic chaos. Behind the scenes, though, something felt off. In later interviews, Jason Alexander admitted that while he respected Heidi Swedberg personally, their comedic timing never clicked. Acting, he explained, is like a dance, and if partners are out of sync, the audience senses it. Other cast members reportedly felt the same when paired with her, struggling to find a rhythm that made Seinfeld's ensemble flow. At one cast dinner, Julia Louis-Dreyfus joked, "Don't you just want to slay her?" It was meant as a quip, but Larry David, always quick to mind stray remarks for storylines, turned it into a solution. If Susan wasn't meshing with the show's rhythm, why not write her out in the most anti-romantic, Seinfeldian way possible? The character Susan's abrupt exit was one of the worst moments in the show. She did not have a good dramatic breakup or a tearful goodbye. Rather, she died after licking cheap wedding invitation envelopes with toxic glue that George had picked to save a few bucks. The punchline was shocking, totally bleakly humorous, and utterly within the domain of Seinfeld. George's unemotional response, being relieved rather than grieving, twisted the knife even further, making it more of a signature moment of darkness. When the episode was shown, there were audible gasps from the audience. Some thought it was an act of cruelty. Others thought it was audacious. But no one forgot it. The death of Susan became a landmark in the legacy of Seinfeld, the moment that proved the show would never acquiesce to the sentimental motives of a sitcom. Years later, Alexander would resurface with his comments about Swedberg. He first started talking about a lack of chemistry, but quickly corrected himself. He sincerely apologized, praised her warmth and professionalism, and noted it wasn't her fault that Susan was slain. That never came into play. It was really about alignment for the comedy. More sensibly, Susan's death became the appropriate end for the show. Seinfeld had never been about growth or even happy endings. George was categorically not intended to have a stable life. His life had been constructed under the heavy burden of all his flaws to be condemned to collapse. Tying Susan's death to his petty cheapness allowed the writers to showcase the cruel indiscriminateness of life with the absurd repercussions of petty choices. As much as it was a kind of gag, serving as a worldview, in Seinfeld, even love might end with toxic glue. And the ironic part is that, not being disposed of, Susan became unforgettable. Her claim to fame, however, is not her connection to George, but rather the preposterous way she exited. Fans, critics, and retrospectives still cite her death as one of the most daring moments in sitcom history, thrown at the audience in the 1990s. For Heidi Swedberg, Susan was but one character among many she had portrayed in a wide career that later featured acting and musical performance, not to mention teaching. To Seinfeld fans, however, she will always be the fiancée put to waste by George's thrift and misfortune. Susan's demise, grim, outrageous, and funny in its cruelty, had all the elements that made Seinfeld different from the other sitcoms of its era. If you thought envelopes were dark, brace yourself. The next story takes things in a whole new direction. Lawrence Tierney, Alton Benes. Of all the recurring family members introduced on Seinfeld, none were more terrifying or unforgettable than Elaine's father, Alton Benes. He appeared in just one episode, Season 2's A Jacket. Yet fans still talk about him decades later. Why? Because Lawrence Tierney, the actor who played him, brought a presence so intimidating, so unsettling, that it not only stole the episode, but also guaranteed the character would never return. When we first meet Alton, he's a towering, stone-faced novelist, loosely modeled after John Cheever and other gruff literary figures of mid-century America. He's ex-military, conservative, and utterly humorless. The setup is simple. Jerry and George join Elaine to meet her father for dinner, but what unfolds is one of the most uncomfortable scenes in sitcom history. Jerry and George shrink under Alton's glare, stumbling over small talk and terrified to say the wrong thing. The tension is so thick it's hilarious. Tierney's performance is pitch perfect. He doesn't wink. He doesn't soften. He plays Alton with the same gravitas he brought to his legendary tough guy roles in classic noir films. That seriousness, dropped into Seinfeld's world of neurotic overthinkers, creates comedy gold. Jerry and George aren't just awkward. They're genuinely afraid. and the audience feels it too. Behind the scenes, though, the intimidation wasn't just acting. Lawrence Tierney had a reputation in Hollywood as a volatile presence. By the time he appeared on Seinfeld, he had lived a turbulent life filled with bar fights, arrests, and clashes with producers. On set, those stories proved more than just rumors. During filming, Tierney allegedly pocketed a prop kitchen knife. When crew members confronted him, he jokingly raised it and mimicked the stabbing motion from Hitchcock's Psycho. The joke didn't land. It rattled everyone. The cast and crew already felt nervous around him, and that moment sealed the decision. Alton Bennis would never appear again. Jerry later remembered the episode, saying everyone was scared to death of Tierney. Jason Alexander told how he and Jerry could barely keep straight faces during their scenes because the tension felt so real around them. Julia Louis-Dreyfus, who would be playing Alton's daughter, merely joked that she had to muster up real fear just to make it through her scenes. Fascinatingly, Tierney, delightful in his chaos, gave an exec who said exactly what the episode demanded. The comedy of the jacket is predicated on contrast. Two insecure guys desperate for approval sitting across from a human wall of intimidation. Without the veracity of Tierney, the episode would not have even come close to working. His inclusion elevated the tale to something of an icon. Still, the sitcom rhythm continues to prosper amongst comfort behind the scenes. That sort of fear cannot be held by cast and crew every time an actor steps onto that set. So while fans might have loved to see more of Elaine's father, one episode played to perfection. Tierney's Alton shone so brightly and terrifyingly, one might add, that Resurrected might have thrown off the precarious balance of comedy and chaos that Seinfeld was honing in its early seasons. And maybe that was for the best. In a way, only having the character Alton Bennis appear once has added to his legendary status. He is like a ghost story in the Seinfeld universe, remembered just as much for his off-screen reputation as for his on-screen portrayal. One dinner, one jacket, one terrifying author novelist. He was gone. What one truly remembers of the jacket is Jerry's fixation with the suede coat, almost as much as the sheer awkwardness of the situation with Elaine's father. Tierney turned an otherwise routine dinner into sitcom history. While perhaps it was his off-camera behavior that prevented him from appearing again, it also ensures that Alton Bennis will exist permanently as a unitary, larger-than-life figure in Seinfeld lore. Lee Garlington, Helen Seinfeld. When most fans picture Jerry's mother on Seinfeld, they see Helen Seinfeld in her Florida condo, fussing over Jerry's health, telling him to wear a jacket, and praising him as a wonderful, wonderful boy. She was a gentle counterbalance to Morty's stubbornness, her maternal warmth becoming a running gag. But, like Morty and Frank Costanza, Helen wasn't always who we remember. In the original pilot, The Seinfeld Chronicles, Helen was played by Lee Garlington. At the time, Garlington was a seasoned actress with film and TV credits. Her version of Helen was polite, sincere, and supportive, very much in line with traditional sitcom moms of the era. She leaned slightly sharp and distant, but overall, she fit the mold of countless television matriarchs. While her performance was solid, it lacked the quirky spark that would later define Seinfeld's supporting cast. Chemistry was also a factor. Paired with Phil Bruns as Morty in the pilot, Garlington's Helen created a set of parents that felt functional but not memorable. Their version of Jerry's home life was grounded and safe, the kind of familiar sitcom-based networks often relied on. But Seinfeld was never meant to be safe. From its earliest episodes, it was pushing against convention, awkward silences, uncomfortable truths, and the comedy of minutiae. To match that, Jerry's parents needed to feel sharper and more distinct. When NBC ordered the series, the producers retooled the family dynamic. Bruns was swapped out for Barney Martin, whose fiery stubbornness gave Morty a lasting presence. And Garlington was replaced by Liz Sheridan, whose softer, more maternal energy became the perfect comedic foil. Sheridan's Helen was a marked departure. Where Garlington leaned into convention, Sheridan infused Helen with overprotective devotion. She worried endlessly about Jerry's meals, his girlfriends, and even his laundry. Her belief in Jerry bordered on the absurd. She saw him as flawless, incapable of wrongdoing, and endlessly deserving of praise. That unwavering faith in her son became a recurring gag, brilliantly undercutting the show's otherwise cynical outlook. Equally important was Sheridan's chemistry with Martin. Together, they instantaneously became archetypes: the combative, prideful father and the doting, smoothing mother. Their banter rang true, but was over the